At 5:45 on KSJE.
Hey everyone, it's your host for the World Beat Show, Scott Duran, and I want you to join me every Saturday at 11 a.m., where I take you on a journey around the world and show you traditional and modern style world beat music. Music from Africa, Spain, France, Japan, China, heck, even songs and artists from the United States itself. So join me every Saturday at 11 a.m. only on the KSJE 90.9 FM.
Hi everyone, I'm Scott Michlin.
And I'm Jenny Lee Ryan.
And we're here to tell you how to become a zero-mile achiever.
First, register online for the 0 Mile Fun Run at KSJE.com.
Second, join us at San Juan College Graduation Plaza on Saturday, May 18th.
Third, run. We'll start the race at 10:30 a.m. on an actual 27-foot course downhill, and that's it.
All proceeds benefit listener-supported KSJE.
So register now at KSJE.com.
This program is supported by San Juan Health Partners Urology, providing a wide range of personalized services for the whole family, including children. Our caring professionals are dedicated to helping meet your urology health needs with skill, experience, and service you need. For a complete listing of our services and to learn more, visit sanjuanhealthpartners.com or call 505-609-6300. San Juan Health Partners Urology, a division of San Juan Regional Medical Center. 11 minutes past 8 o'clock. It's Thursday morning, May the 2nd. Good morning, everyone. I'm Scott Michlin, and thank you for tuning in to KSJE 90.9 FM, the information and cultural beacon of the Four Corners, broadcasting to you from San Juan College. Special good morning to our viewers who are joining us live, watching us on the video stream on the KSJE Facebook page and YouTube channel. Welcome aboard, everybody. Coming up in just a moment, one of my favorite guests on the program, Paul Reed, is here in the studio. Archaeologist Paul Reed. We have a couple of great topics to talk about this morning, so we hope you'll stay tuned for that. We'll be starting that in just a few moments right here on KSJE. Then later on this hour, we'll do what we do on Thursdays, which is talk about the economy. Jason Kelko will be here from Citizens Trust and Investment Corporation. Let us know how the markets are doing, what the deal is with the Federal Reserve, what's happening in Venezuela with oil, and all these different things that are affecting the economy here in North America. So that's coming up this morning at 8:55. After the news at 9 o'clock, Mick Hess will be here roving with the arts. Today, Mick is playing more Bach cantatas for us on the radio, so we hope you'll join us for that coming up after the news. And then today at noon, it is the second edition of Right on Four Corners, our local and regional author program. Tracy Hales-Vass is speaking with author Rory McClanahan today at noon about his book called Welcome to Golden. That is coming up today at 12:06 right here on KSJE. Also, don't forget, if you want to support this radio station in a fun way, we hope you'll join us on May 18th for the KSJE 0 Mile Fun Run. It is happening at 10 o'clock. Actually, the race is at 10:30. You can pick up your T-shirt at 10. Race is at 10:30. The race will be over at 10:31 because it's a 0 Mile Fun Run. You can go to KSJE.com to register today for $15 or $20 on the day of the race if you join us here at San Juan College Graduation Plaza, Saturday, May 18th. So hope you'll join us for that, everybody. And let me introduce our guest who is with us here in the studio. It doesn't happen very often, but we're so glad when it does. Paul Reed is here from Archaeologist Southwest in Salmon Ruins. Paul, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Scott. So glad to be here.
Good to have you here.
And unrehearsed, untaped, and
right.
Whatever.
It is live. That's very true. So good to have you here and to see you in person. Normally we see you via Skype from your home, and so you've made the trip across the mountains, and here you are.
I have, and the weather allowed me to come, which is amazing.
True.
With the winter we've had.
That is very true, and I bet there's still some snow in some of those mountains as you were traveling over.
Yeah, pretty high up. Still got quite a bit. The rivers are starting to run, and that's great.
It's been nice to see.
News.
Yeah, very different from where we were last year. A lot of folks have been commenting on that, so that's been exciting. But there's a couple of stories that have been in the news that I wrote you about and asked if these were true, first of all, before I shared them as fake news or something,
right.
And if it's actually possible. And you told me that, yes, they were, so it was really amazing. The first one particularly that we'll get into, and then we'll get that off the plate. But this story about the remains of this ancient individual, and they were looking at his poop, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Right.
And it appears that he had eaten a rattlesnake.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, he ate the entire rattlesnake.
I mean, the whole thing, not like cut it up or anything, but the whole thing, right?
Tail, the head, the
Yeah.
fangs, and it turns out a whole mouse that probably was inside the rattlesnake.
Oh,
was
well,
the,
you
was the
know.
speculation.
Balanced meal? I don't know what
Yeah.
you call that, but okay. And so I pulled the article here for viewers who are watching us, everybody. This was off of the Daily Star, which I'm not sure is a very reputable piece of journalism, but apparently the story is true.
It is.
Okay.
Yeah, and it made the rounds, and other
Gotcha.
outlets picked it up.
And
But,
so for you, do you just roll your eyes, or do you just look at
Well,
this as interesting?
they were speculating that perhaps this was some kind of ritual activity, potentially because of the significance of snakes to different indigenous folks, and that maybe it was consumed ritually.
Right.
It doesn't sound very pleasant, no matter what. And
Yeah.
you'd think that maybe you would cut the head off.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this was a fairly complete,
Rattlesnake. I mean, those aren't...
snake.
Yeah. They're poisonous.
Yeah, right. With
Right?
the fangs full
Yeah.
of poison, presumably. They speculated that the individual must not have been poisoned severely, because normal digestive cycles, it had to be at least 12 to 24 to 48 hours before
He lived long enough
he
to...
did his thing.
Right.
Produces coprolite, as we call them in the archaeological world. And,
Okay.
left that in the site for someone to come along and study.
Right. Interesting. And this was in the Four Corners, right? That was the other
it was
part
in
of the
Texas.
story. Oh, was it in Texas? Okay.
Yeah, it's down in Texas, so pretty close at hand.
Okay.
And about 1,500 years ago. So this is back, when folks were gathering and hunting and following game, doing their thing.
Okay.
Yeah, and occasionally eating snakes. Now, snake isn't bad. I don't know if you've had it. I've had it. It sort of does tasted to me like kind of desiccated chicken.
All right. I don't recall if I've ever had snake, not on purpose maybe, but okay.
Not necessarily the food you would seek out, but
Right.
people make use of the resources. And again, this case is unusual because there was clearly a reason to not just cut off the head and the tail and maybe go for the part that actually had some meat on it. And there's not much meat on them to begin with, realistically.
Right.
But there were scales and skin, so this was like a full consumption.
The whole thing.
Which does sort of suggest specialized
Some kind of
ritual behavior.
Bad frat party? I'm just trying to figure out what it could...
an ancient initiation ritual. You got to eat the whole snake.
The whole snake.
Then
That's
you're
it.
in, and life is good.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah,
but we know that this was not part of the regular diet of these people.
No.
Even cut up and even prepared in a different way, right?
No, and I wouldn't swear that fangs had never been recovered in this way before, but it's pretty rare.
Yeah.
Pretty unlikely.
Okay.
So, as a resource, we know people eat all kinds of, different critters.
Right.
Particularly at times when maybe they don't have the more desirable foods.
Sure.
But yeah, this is a different deal.
Yeah. Something else was going on.
Yeah.
I guess, archaeologically speaking.
And we will never know is the reality of it.
Right.
So that opens the door to whatever you want to speculate about. As
Interesting.
long as we don't bring aliens into it, I think we're fine.
You're okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay, but maybe, okay. But fascinating, right? I mean, this is something that makes you sit up and say, wow, that's interesting, I suppose, and we've not seen that other places.
We talk about the continuum of human behavior, past and present, and this is pushing it, whichever side we want to put that on of our circle, maybe. But it's just another point on that circle of here's something that someone did in the past, and, where do we fit that in exactly?
Right. And we know it's a human being. We don't know if it was man or woman, but a lot of folks have theorized that only a man would do that.
It was probably a guy.
Yeah, only a guy would do that.
We're the gross ones in our species who will eat all kinds of weird things.
Yeah, on a dare or otherwise, I suppose. So,
exactly.
But who knows?
Women are too smart for that.
Apparently, that's true. So, but interesting, I guess. And again, has there been evidence around this area from the work you've done at Chaco and Salmon of people eating maybe things that you wouldn't expect them to be eating?
I don't know of snakes entering the record that way. You know, a lot of coprolites came out of one room specifically at Solomon Pueblo, but there weren't any mentions of anything this dramatic.
The regular diet, I guess.
Yeah, pretty much the regular diet, the corn, beans, and squash, you know, evidence of different kinds of meat, you know, some smaller rodents that we don't always think of as, you know, primary foods.
But they did.
They did,
right?
Upon occasions.
Yeah.
You know, and actually very rarely some fish that were in the river in the San Juan indigenously. Actually a form of salmon. So figure that the Solomon salmon name, you know, there's some kind of connection there.
Right.
And a type of fish that's related to carp that was in the river, you know, in those days. No trout. That's all a modern introduction to that people love to fish and stock up, but not any in the San Juan, probably.
Nothing from back that far.
Aboriginally. Yeah.
Interesting.
But varied diet, but not including rattlesnake, as far as we know.
Okay. But pretty healthy diet, I would suppose, right?
Well,
in those days.
Right. And being next to the river, certainly access to clean water, which was big.
Yes.
Yeah. And a lot of different resources.
Right. But meat, not so much. I mean, they would certainly have it once in a while.
Yeah, but... Well, you know, Solomon's got a real interesting pattern because early on in the Chaco time period, we have lots of, you know, relatively large quantities of big game. So we have the deer, the elk, the mountain, the bighorn sheep, things coming from relatively higher elevation, a whole lot of bunnies, both cottontail and jackrabbits, you know, some prairie dogs and gophers in that class. And then later in time, the big game drops off and they started raising turkeys in a huge way after about 1190, 1200. So we have turkey pens, different points in the Pueblo that were added later, and just turkey eggshell, literally in about every single room that was looked at. So the turkeys became big,
and they were a big part of the meals then, not just as pets or as
and ritually producing the feathers that we know went into certain, you know, items, garments, and other things. But yeah, they became a huge resource, and this is something that archaeologists still ponder: what caused the shift? Because the turkeys had been raised by Puebloan people since the 600s. On some kind of scale. They were domestic. They were using particularly the tail feathers for different things. But they really weren't eating them by and large. And then at some point, you know, turkeys became a very viable and used food source.
Gotcha.
You know, and so I was just talking with a colleague about that at a recent archaeological conference, and we were just kind of pondering it. And one of the ideas had been that perhaps they'd hunted out the big game by this point in time. It was too far to go out to get the game. And, you know, I think that's in the realm of consideration, but it's a pretty fundamental shift to having few turkeys in, you know, Chaco era and earlier archaeological sites for the Pueblo folks. After 1200, everyone in the Four Corners literally is raising turkeys. So there was a big cultural shift. And for me, that had to be something more than just resource scarcity or abundance.
Easier?
Yeah, well, certainly.
I guess.
At some
and
point, you
more
go,
convenient
wow, these,
to just go outside and
these
get
turkeys
dinner?
are here. You can have relatively young children sort of keep track of them and, you know, pen them up. And they were feeding them corn. So in some ways, the irony is that the diet became even more corn dependent, we think. But of course, turkeys are omnivorous too. They eat bugs. Right. And, you know, they go around pecking for different types of foods. So that might have actually helped with other, you know, pest control, if you will. So yeah, an interesting cultural shift.
Pretty clever.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Well, that was one story that we wanted to talk about this morning, and I think it's fascinating, and as I always do. And then the other issue was on these on some footprints. Right. That have been discovered, and this is up in Alaska, correct?
Right, yeah, this is well up at a place called Swan Point in central Alaska, and a single footprint that they found of what looks like a young teenager or tween, you know, 12, 13, 14.
Right.
Of course, can't tell male or female.
Sure.
But yeah, and a foot that was in a moccasin, some kind of, you know, relatively thin footwear that left a really nice impression in an archaeological site.
Interesting. This is an article from Forbes that we're showing everyone on the screen this morning. But and the images that go along with the article, Paul, what are they showing us? I guess from the depression in the rock that's to the left. Is that what we have?
And a comparison to the foot, you know, as it would have appeared, and then like a full color image that really brings out the different ridges and things, and then, you know, just a nice photograph that's enhanced on the right. So, yeah, the science really lets us do just all kinds of really interesting things to sort of break down, pull things apart, and then put them back together.
Right.
And try and understand, you know, what we're looking at.
Well, and to show why they think this depression is a footprint and not just a puddle.
Right, exactly.
I suppose, right?
Some other potentially natural or cultural phenomenon.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is definitely a footprint. And this site is interesting. It dates back to about 1,800 years ago. So quite a while ago. And, we get footprints. Of course, going way back in our history, there are famous footprints in Africa of early human ancestors, the Laetoli footprints at, I think, 2.7 or 8 million years ago. So this isn't totally, this isn't the earliest. It's not, a super rare finding, but a nice one, because this gets us back to the people who lived in these sites. And
right.
a lot of times archaeologists, other researchers are working with pieces of stone, remains of animals, maybe what's left of a house, and it's sometimes hard to sort of bring the humanity back. So when we get footprints, fingerprints, handprints a lot of times in rock art, those are really, for me, just super interesting connections back to the people.
Sure.
The people of the time.
And this article talks about that this gives us an idea of the types of people that were living in this pretty inhospitable part of Alaska, right? I mean, this is pretty, back in this time was pretty cold still.
Yeah, definitely pretty cool. But an area with a lot of resources as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, Alaska's pretty wet, and so you've got a whole lot of plants and animal resources. And these folks, like the individual who had the rattlesnake in Texas
right.
many years ago, these folks were gatherer hunters as well. So they were moving across the landscape, setting up temporary camps. They had a little bit of a sort of a house pit that was dug, not a super formal pit house like we see later in time, but a place where they were living with a spruce bark superstructure, little structure around it, and and a cooking hearth and some other storage areas. And so this was home for a period of time,
right?
And they spent time in this. The archaeologists found it. They were studying the floor of the structure, and that's when this particular little footprint popped out. So
interesting. Okay. And so what else can we learn from this, that this area was inhabited back in this time, and these
right.
folks were on the move? It wasn't a permanent structure as
right.
far as we can tell. And is this part of that? Because, again, we know there's different eras when these people stopped moving around and started building more permanent structures like what we see today in Salmon and Chaco and Aztec.
Right.
And became more of a community, right, than just
right.
maybe family groups, I suppose.
Yeah, and this is at a point, 1,800 years ago, so just after the transition to the Common Era, so 200-ish CE or AD. And right, in this part of Alaska, people really aren't settling permanently into villages until quite a bit later.
Right.
And we're also not on the coast, so we're sort of in the middle of the continent, well, in the middle of the Alaskan, area, the wilderness at that point. They're moving around, finding the resources, but not saying, we're going to invest a lot of time in building in a permanent structure here. We see that later in time, and particularly in coastal areas, because we get over to Alaska and especially down the coasts of British Columbia and Washington, and we see people who really never developed a whole lot of agricultural types of endeavors, but they were fishing,
right.
Tremendously. And this individual was probably part of a group that used those marine resources as well when they could get them. And what that allowed on the coast is for people to create amazing societies and cultures and be pretty much permanently settled there. Mm-hmm. Without doing a whole lot of farming. And that's basically just, the resources that were available, tremendous amounts of fish and game and, other plant materials that they were gathering.
Right. But this group probably wasn't the group that was maybe moving or transitioning down that coast. That's a much earlier era,
right,
correct?
Right. And these folks we think were probably part of an Athabascan-speaking group, because that's pretty much what we see from the maps that have been generated and studying the languages going back through time. So we have a sense of, an idea of their larger ethnic group without really being able to zero in on a specific group. And of course, things shift a lot through time. So one of the tricky things is we have groups that are in, living today and have been documented historically, and we can track them through different periods of time. But it's difficult when you get back in time to say this group definitely belonged to this now named entity,
right,
that considers it a self-abounded, tribal group, essentially.
Sure.
So, and we've really gotten away from that in archaeology and anthropology as well, because we know that people really, what we talk about as their social identity is really quite fluid, that it varies through time, and that it's particularly if groups, most groups have, relationships with outside groups, and they usually pick mates from outside their own group. And this is what human groups have done for a while. So they'll basically partner in a way to marry their kids off to someone in a different group.
Right.
And in that way, their network expands. They have access to other resources, other social resources when they need them. But then their group also expands as well. And so those individuals born to a person from this village who married a person from this village, how do they identify? And to this day, people meet and my mom's family's from here, but dad's from over there. Right? So you immediately, as a young person, have this dual identity of mom's side, dad's side. And if those groups speak perhaps different languages, then, you essentially get to choose, I'm affiliated with my mother's people, but then we go visit dad, and then I realize that, I'm really Irish or whatever it is.
Right.
If you're of European descent.
Yes.
So, so we understand, I think, through a lot of study that you can't just say this is this particular group and we can take it back 2,000 years in time, because people move around and things shift a lot.
Right.
And it makes it a lot more interesting. It makes it difficult to say, here's what happened at this point in time.
True.
But, that's why they pay us the small bucks, as we say in archaeology.
Well,
and anthropology, to continue to study all these relationships.
Right. And we still see a little bit of that, do we not, in maybe the Navajo clan system and things like that, and how important that is to folks in the Dene
right.
these days?
Exactly. Lots of different relationships where people belong to not just one clan, but 4, actually.
Right.
The one they're born for, the one they're born into, and then their grandparents' clans. So, so there's
that's very important and meaningful to
very important, and that basically centers people in their world with those clan relationships. And other groups, for other groups, it's a little different, but it's the same notion of this is who I am as an individual person, but also how I connect to my larger social group, and which aspects of those groups might be more important here and then more important over here.
Right.
So,
and I know for a lot of the Dene, it's a really source of pride to be able to introduce themselves with their clans in their native language.
Yes, absolutely. It's a big part of their social identity as an individual, and then building up through their families. Right. Definitely.
Now, with this particular instance, again, before we go on to another topic, Paul Reed, is with these footprints, of course, no DNA evidence and nothing like that we can extrapolate from what they were able to find, right? But they did find a sandal, I guess, maybe nearby or something, or related, or just another, just to show us the size? Yeah,
it was basically, when they studied it, it was clear that it wasn't a person who was barefoot. So there was a thin covering, a moccasin, sandal, some kind of footwear. Right. That they weren't 100% sure about. And then other remains from the site. But things like sandals fall into the category that we describe as perishable materials.
Right.
So they don't preserve very easily in open settings. At a site like Salmon and Aztec, and certainly in more dry cave and rock shelter settings, a lot of these materials preserve because they don't get wet.
Right.
And the normal biological breakdown activities just don't happen.
Sure.
Essentially, they don't rot; they're preserved. In this case, they didn't recover that. But
I see. But we have another sample. Is that what they're showing us in this photo? I guess.
Yeah.
It looks like a potato. Pardon me for saying that, but but it's really a sandal, I guess.
Yeah, that's an historic Athabascan moccasin. So it's a
that I just called a potato.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a comparison, so that you could see this is likely
what they wore,
analog for the footwear.
I see. Thank you.
And that's what created the footprint. So.
Gotcha. Interesting. Well, again, fascinating. And again, it adds to the knowledge base of what we know about this region, about these people, about this era in time, because we can date these things.
Right.
And so we do know at least kind of when that footprint was made.
Right. Yeah, they got an exact date at 1,850 years ago.
Yeah.
So, so we can put that in time, and then it's another piece in what is, a very fascinating story for this group and for others. As we go back in time, we have another data point, another bit of insight, if you will, into how this particular group of people lived, and it helps us understand the larger questions as well. Yeah, very true. Well, we want to talk a little bit about something else this morning, which is near and dear to both of our hearts, I know, and that is Chaco Canyon, and you are is it a working group? What's the official name of the thing that you were appointed to? Yeah, our state land commissioner, newly elected in November, Stephanie Garcia Richard, as one of her campaign promises, she had talked about withdrawing lands, state lands, within the 10-mile zone that has been talked about now for a few years around Chaco. Let me back up for a minute. There's federal legislation pending that would withdraw the federal acreage in the zone around the primary sites in Chaco, out to the east at Pueblo Pintado, and another site to the southwest. And just to be clear, there's been some interesting reports that I've read in the print media primarily, basically saying that this is no oil and gas development at all in this zone. And we have such a mix of land jurisdiction, as we've talked. You know, it's the checkerboard area. There's BLM surface, BLM subsurface control, and there's a lot of Navajo Nation lands, both tribal trust lands, and then individual allotments. So people who have basically their own piece of land. And there's some administration from Window Rock and from BIA and Gallup. But primarily
plus state, plus federal.
Yeah, plus the state lands. And then, occasional bits of other just private
Still
land.
private, right? Okay.
Right. So the federal legislation pending would withdraw the activity, the minerals, only on the federal part. And that's something like 19% of the surface.
Okay.
So about a fifth. And we'd still have the 80% potentially that could be developed depending upon the scenario. So knowing that this bill was originally introduced in the Senate last July, didn't go anywhere in that particular Senate, but this year, reintroduction in the Senate with some other provisions to put some more protections in place for the people living out in Liebrecht and Counselor, and a companion House bill introduced by Ben Ray Lujan and Deb Haaland in our delegation here in New Mexico. So that's going to do its thing in the federal process. The State Land Commissioner campaigned on many issues, but among them was to withdraw the minerals basically for state lands, state trust lands in a 10-mile zone. And the map looks a little different than the exact federal map, because we have state, about 2 sections in every township and range are state trust lands designed to generate monies for our schools, our educational institutions, museums, libraries, other things. So there's a definite connection to our state budget in these lands. But the commissioner felt that it was important to protect, our World Heritage Site at Chaco and the lands around that. And we have a number of important outlying sites within that 10-mile zone. So, people have wondered if this was an arbitrary designation. Did you just draw a circle with, a 10-mile radius? And it really is not arbitrary. This is the area that has the highest density of sites related to Chaco that are not currently protected in a state park, a national park, or anywhere else. And there is a large section along the North Road that has other resources that we're concerned about that goes outside the 10-mile. But it really is a very important archaeological zone. And that's why people are taking the action.
Sure.
They are. So.
But some people are concerned because she did this with an executive order, and so it wasn't from the legislature, it wasn't from any other process, but she feels she can do this with an executive order as a state land commissioner.
Exactly, and that's the way that the position is set up by statute in New Mexico. So a state land commissioner has a tremendous amount of leeway to exercise authority in these matters.
And the issue is, once again, and again, I always like to make this very clear, the park has never really been endangered. The park as we know it, the borders and things like that is always going to be protected. No one's going to put in a well pad outside Pueblo Bonito.
No, that's right.
Just outside the front door or something like that. That's always protected. But what we're talking about is this other kind of buffer area just outside the boundary of the park that some folks have some concerns about, from either maybe impacting the views, the night skies, and the underground discoveries that maybe have yet to be discovered, or what we know of, or things along that line. Am I pretty accurate in that description?
Right, exactly. So if people have been to Chaco, you go to Pueblo Bonito, and then if you take the hike, you go a little further west, you go up on top, you end up at the site called Pueblo Alto, which is basically the gateway site to Chaco if you're coming from the north into the south. And then you go up to Pueblo Alto, you can walk up to a point where the Great North Road takes off, and you can look straight up towards our area. You can see Huerfano, the top of Huerfano Mesa, and that's the zone we're talking about, this area right outside the park boundaries. And, if we were to allow oil and gas development within that zone, then people going up to look at Pueblo Alto to get a sense of the North Road and just sort of get Chaco fixed in their minds, because the other thing you can do is there's a great overlook that puts you in a great view looking down on Pueblo Bonito, Chetro Kettle, the other sites. So it's really an orienting experience for people. And I think for others, it's a spiritual experience. They get up and they really connect to it. So if we allow oil and gas development up to the borders of Chaco in the park, then we could have drill rigs literally visible just right outside the boundary. And you would go up there to enjoy, this piece of Puebloan heritage and everyone's heritage, really. And you'd have a drill rig making noise, putting out, different odors from the oil and gas development. And you might have permanent pump jacks then, just right out there, constantly moving,
right, and
and producing all those effects. So, it's really not a simple, let's have oil and gas, let's not. It's let's work hard on where we can do the oil and gas so it doesn't affect either ancient archaeological sites, modern day people's experiences, the folks living on the ground zero, and Liebrecht and Counselor. So it's really, how do we figure out how to get the resources we need, but protect these other resources and values that, a good percentage of our country, most of us really believe in those values.
Right.
So it's not a yes or no. It's never been about that with the work that we've done with our partners. It's about how to achieve a compromise that gets us the resources we need, but also protects the areas that are irreplaceable.
Sure.
And if we damage Chaco or its components, then those are gone forever, and we don't have the ability to enjoy them. We can't pass those on to our future generations.
And I think it's important to talk about a compromise because, again, here we are at a radio station, or we have electricity, we have things made of plastic and oil, and you and I drove here in our cars and things like that. So we know we're not going to we can never get away from using oil and using plastics and using fossil fuels, at least in the short term.
Right.
And so we're always going to have a need for this, at least in the short term, until something better comes along, which isn't here yet. But the idea to do it maybe thoughtfully and compromise and being able to maybe set aside this area where development then can be happening in another part of the state, another part of the region, without so much historic significance is what you're talking about. At least I think you're talking about.
No, that's exactly right, Scott. It's a balancing act to protect the areas that most people are concerned about, but allow responsible development, and that's really what we've been talking about with our partners the last 6 years as we've been part of this.
And pardon me for interrupting, but we've kind of seen this as some parcels have been introduced maybe for bids or for development, but then they've been withdrawn. I mean, it's kind of been a piecemeal type of occasion, but it makes everyone kind of hold their breath for a few weeks as these things are on the market, I guess, to be developed, but then they're withdrawn. Isn't that what we've had in the past?
Right, and that's, and so that's part of the history of this 10-mile exclusion zone, is occasionally parcels will be nominated by companies because they're wanting to explore resources there. And BLM has honored at least a verbal policy of not allowing development in there. The other thing they're doing, as we've talked on the show for several years now, is they're modifying their long-range plan, their resource management plan. They're amending it, producing a new environmental impact statement that's supposed to be a comprehensive look at the impacts of this specific oil and gas development, and not going back 100 years, but just what's being proposed now and what's been ongoing since about 2011. So as part of that process, a number of us had pushed BLM to think about protecting Chaco in this 10-mile zone while this plan was moving forward, so that we wouldn't have impacts before we had a new plan that would, hopefully protect some of these areas. So we don't know at this point what's going to be in the plan for that 10-mile zone. There have been different options proposed, a much smaller protective zone or the 10-mile or something in between. So that process is still ongoing, and it's really unclear. But what we've asked, and what a lot of our tribal partners in particular, the El Pueblo Council of Governors, the Pueblo of Acoma, and a number of other groups, Navajo Nation, have asked that BLM not lease in this area and that they just stop doing that until the plan's done. And so that's part of the challenge. I mean, by their regulations, BLM is required to hold oil and gas lease sales every quarter in every BLM area. So this is it's a pretty daunting task if you think about it. So they're leasing. I think of that as the middle ground while these plans are being developed in an overarching sense.
Right.
But the leasing doesn't stop. And that's what a lot of people have really been sort of upset and confused about, because it's like, we haven't finished your plan, so how can you responsibly allow the leasing to go on? So a lot of people have weighed in on that, and that's why when parcels come up that are in Chaco's 10-mile zone or in other sensitive areas, people get really concerned and they start talking about it.
Sure.
Because this is piecemeal, like you said, and we need that plan plan. So that the pressure's on for that.
Now, if this federal legislation were to go through, would that supersede any BLM plan that they would come up with?
It definitely would.
I see.
Politically, it hard to handicap that. And if our current president probably wouldn't sign this legislation if it went through, it's really hard to know.
I see.
So that and that the legislative process is folks may be aware, and you're aware, is a long process. So it may well take months or even years to get some of that through. So we continue to work with our partners, with BLM, with our tribal partners to try to have some positive impact to protect these areas and not just allow development without proper consideration. So that's kind of where we're at on it.
But where we are right now, we can say for sure is that the state land is off the table. That has been
state land is off the table. That's an order. It certainly could be challenged legally, but it is in, and I think it expires at the end of the year in 2023. So there's a time limit on it. And a future commissioner could potentially do something different.
Of course.
But we consider this a very important step to protect, again, a resource that almost every segment of our society acknowledges should be protected.
Right. But wouldn't it make sense to maybe have some permanent legislation from the Roundhouse in Santa Fe that would protect this permanently? There wouldn't be any expiration depending on who's the commissioner and who's not?
They could definitely do that.
Yeah.
And I think our current governor would definitely support that. So, we really didn't. A lot of things happened in our legislative session earlier this year, but not a whole lot of sort of cultural resource things were in the mix. Obviously, bigger issues with budgets and education and sorting out some of those. Not saying the cultural resources aren't important, but they have a lot of work to do in a relatively short period of time. And I think next year, is just a 30-day.
That's true.
So, but it would be nice to get some additional protections in through a legislative action. And I think people might feel like that was more broadly representing the state. From our perspective, this is a good first step.
Great.
And there are a lot of other state trust lands that are being developed, have oil and gas resources on them, and that process is ongoing. So again, it's not a yes or no. It's how do we sort this out as a society and decide what to protect and where to develop.
Sure. But if we're talking about Chaco Canyon and its buffer zone, it sounds like it's definitely a no from a lot of folks.
Well, that's a lot. That's what we hear from most of the people we talk to. There's not too many people saying we should have active oil and gas development right up to Chaco's boundary. I mean, that's just that. I don't think that benefits anyone. The reality of the Mancos Shale, too, at least from what I understand, talking to geologists and industry people, is as you get further and closer to Chaco, it really is more difficult to extract the product from the Mancos Shale. So it's a more costly process. So there are other areas where the mineral resource can be accessed more easily.
Right. But we'll see what happens.
Right.
But we are out of time, Paul Reed, I'm sorry to say, because we could keep talking about this for another hour or so, I'm sure. But it's a complicated topic. But again, it's always interesting to hear your viewpoints on it and get an update and see what's going on, because I know you feel very passionately about protecting the greater Chaco region of New Mexico.
Yes, I do. Well, thanks for having me on, Scott.
You bet.
Great to be here.
Thanks for coming. Good to see you in person. And maybe next month we'll talk about something a little different.
Sounds good.
All right, very good. That's Paul Reed from Salmon Ruins and Archaeology Southwest, my guest here on KSJE. Back with more in just a moment, everybody. The time is 8:47. This program is supported by San Juan Regional Medical Center, who's expanding its services to offer low-cost blood screenings all year round, now offering walk-in convenience to get the blood tests you want when you want them. MyLabs, patient-ordered testing, is available in Farmington at the hospital's laboratory and the Outpatient Diagnostic Center on 30th Street. Also in Aztec at San Juan Health Partners Family Medicine at 120 Llanos Street. With nearly 20 tests available, there's an option for everyone. MyLabs, patient-ordered testing.